Joe Biden's just announced a new subsidy of over $1 billion to General Motors and Stellantis and Volvo to convert abandoned ICE factories to EVs. Hey, hang on a minute. Volvo? Volvo may have a headquarters in Sweden, but they're owned by Geely. That's a wholly Chinese company. This is sheer hypocrisy. It subsidises its own auto industry while imposing tariffs on Chinese because they are subsidised by their government. Anyway, they won't work. I'm Dave, welcome to Dave Takes It On. Why won't subsidies work? Well, and why concentrate on America when we live in the UK? Well, history, not me, tells us subsidies usually don't work. Think to General Motors, DeLorean, British Leyland. And also understand that what happens in the US will have a massive impact on what happens here, Europe, Japan and China. We live in a global economy. Back to subsidies. Have they ever worked? Really worked, rather than just being a sticking plaster to get over a short-term issue? But first you need to look at the other government policies. See, high tariffs on Chinese imports means EVs will be dearer than necessary. The US government still subsidises the oil and gas industry up to anything around about $50 billion in some years, supporting the ICE car industry. Well, here in the UK, we proudly announce we no longer subsidise the oil industry. That's true, but we do offer massive tax breaks worth billions a year towards the exploration costs. Well, the final decider against subsidies is the financial health of the legacy auto industry. Ford and GM have around 150 billion each in debt. Volkswagen has 210 billion. Toyota 240 billion, Honda 67 billion, Renault 72 billion. But debt on its own says little. Debt can actually be a help if you're actually good for the repayments. Debt only becomes a problem when you can't afford to repay it, or the debt grows to be more than the asset value. That's negative equity. So Ford makes about 25 billion profit a year, so it needs about 6 years of using that total profit reinvested to clear the debt. GM has 19 billion, that takes 8 years. Volkswagen, 20 billion, that's going to take 10 years. Toyota has 31 billion, that's 8 years. Honda, 24 billion, 3 years. Well, would you rather run a business that would need to spend every single penny of its profits over the next 10 years to clear the debt, or one that could pay it off from petty cash? So who could pay off their total debts today using available cash? Well, Honda can. They've got 28 billion cash against 24 billion debt. That's it, apart from Tesla. 9 billion debt versus 26 billion in the bank. All the rest couldn't. Ford could clear about 10% of their total debt, General Motors 20%, Volkswagen 1/3 and Toyota just 15%. So few auto manufacturers are looking healthy on that metric. But even those that are deep in debt may have nothing at all to worry about if they have booming sales, increasing profitability, and the assets to back up those debts. You see, a person may have a huge mortgage, but if their house is worth far more, in an emergency they can sell up and pay it all off. On the other hand, if the property market crashes and the outstanding mortgage is greater than the house value, you're in negative equity. But even that need not mean a problem, as millions found out in one of the numerous property price crashes we've lived through. If you have a good salary, you can afford the repayments, and if you don't have to sell the house, say for a job move, then negative equity is just not a real issue. Just keep paying, and eventually the house price will rise again, or your debt will reduce as you make your payments. The problem arises when you're in negative equity and you have a reducing or zero income to be able to make the full monthly repayments. And for one reason or another, you've either got to sell the house or borrow more money. So let's take a quick look at the situation for the major auto manufacturers. VW has total assets of a massive $647 billion against a debt of $210 billion. That looks good, doesn't it? Toyota has an equally massive 550 billion versus 240 billion again, really healthy. Ford has 273 billion against 152 billion debt, and General Motors 273 billion as well versus 152 billion in debt. Well, these look really healthy and rosy, and in most cases these companies appear to be thriving. But that is not the whole picture. In reality, many are in really deep trouble. Let's go back to that negative equity in the property market. It presented no problem to most of us because unless you need to remortgage, according to the bank or the building society holding your mortgage, your property was still worth what it was when you bought it. They don't revalue your property every year or every time there's a bust or boom in the housing market. You only find out how much more or less it's worth when you apply for a loan or remortgage using your house as equity and it's valued. So, quick example. If your house was £100,000, you borrowed £90,000 to buy it, you've got £10,000 equity. If the house rises in value to £150,000 and your debt remains largely the same, £90,000, and you need to remortgage after your initial 2-year fixed term expires, you should not only be able to remortgage quite easily if nothing else has changed, but your loan to value percentage has dropped and you may be offered a much better interest rate. However, if your house price has crashed in value, say it's down to £70,000, then now you have a serious problem. No bank will lend you almost £90,000 for a remortgage on a house that's only worth £70,000. That is where the legacy auto has a massive problem. Are their assets worth what they state? See, many factories that cost hundreds of millions or maybe over $1 billion to build now sit empty around the world, shut down, mothballed. Some have been empty for many years. Well, why don't they just sell them? Because nobody wants to buy them. If it is sitting empty, it is either because there's no demand for the product the factory makes, or the factory cannot make those products at a low enough cost to make it profitable. So who in the right mind would buy an unwanted, derelict ICE car factory? The only one I can think of, an actual recent event, was the Fremont, California factory. It was originally built as a joint venture between General Motors and Toyota, but it lost money and the partnership failed. It shut down and laid empty for years before finally selling it to Tesla for $42 million. $42 million! A factory that probably cost the best part of $1 billion was sold off for mere pocket money. So take a close look at the legacy auto industry factories and you find many of them are already shut down. Their production in many cases has also shifted to countries with cheaper labour, Mexico or China. Those factories in many cases are still on the company books at their original values. So the assets stated are not the real picture, but it actually gets far worse. Auto manufacturers constantly refinance, take out new loans and use their working factories as collateral. It is vital that those factories retain their book value. But the banks are now getting very nervous. See, if asked for a loan to build a new factory making, say petrol cars, hybrids even, engines or gearboxes, and that's going to take 3 or 4 years to complete, they may not be keen to lend if the move to EVs succeeds in a big way, and by 2030 most new car sales are EVs. Nobody's buying petrol. Likewise, if they were asked to lend money on a new factory making only EVs, taking 3 or 4 years to complete, how many EVs will they be able to sell in 2030? If the bans are all reduced, can they sell any at all? So the willingness for banks to lend is dramatically reduced. And at the same time, the value of their assets is set to plummet. See, if a bank does lend billions for a new factory or refurbishment making only EVs, and it succeeds, and the entire car buying public switches to driving EVs by 2030, then the value of the ICE factories listed as collateral would become virtually zero. maybe just a few million if there are companies like Tesla or BYD who want them, which they probably won't. That is probably the major reason why Legacy Auto is not going all out hell for leather into EVs. If they did and actually succeeded, it would almost overnight wipe out all they have built up over the last century. It would slash their current assets down to almost zero and slash their own ICE car sales down to zero, hoping they can make up for all that with the profits from their new EV sales. Yeah, you see the problem. What happens if they crash the ICE and hybrid sales to zero, but cannot actually get EVs to make any profit at all, which is where they are at the moment? Well, Legacy Auto and ICE versus EV is heading towards a mighty clash, and the banks are likely stuck in the middle. If they make the wrong call and lend, they could lose everything. If they make the right call and win, the assets those loans are raised against will disappear, and the original loans will then fall into default. So have a quick look at the successful Legacy Auto factories in the well, yeah, if you could, if they existed. They're all struggling. Many have already closed down. That's some in Michigan, hovering on the brink. Stellantis Belvidere Assembly Plant, Indiana Transmission Plant, they're already closed. And a former Georgia plant, which is closed, will also receive $75 million to make electric buses. Cummins factory to convert just part of it to make electric motors, and Volvo, they get over $200 million in Maryland, Virginia and Pennsylvania, and a further $157 million in Michigan to make EV components. It's a really sorry state, and I'm convinced that if this wasn't an election year in the States, few or no bailouts would be on offer. Ford, meanwhile, seem to have missed out on this round, but a look at their factory locations reveals they've already moved some of them to Argentina, Mexico, and what? China? There are 5 joint ventures in China. And GM are a little better. They've got factories in Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, China, SAIC, joint venture. So America subsidises the oil industry and subsidises EVs at the same time. They seriously support factories that operate union members. And the bulk of the latest subsidies are going to swing states, vital to the Democrats in the November elections. I don't get too political. I'm appalled that the presidential candidate for the Democrats is funded largely by the auto union donations, while the Republican candidate, convicted felon, is rumoured to be receiving massive funds from the oil and gas giants. So Biden appears to be trying to buy votes in the swing states, but it's likely to be no avail. Almost all the auto companies have been bailed out at some point in history, and they're still going bust 100 years later. Yeah, even Ford, they accepted no direct bailouts, but they received very, very lucrative government auto contracts during the war. Well, subsidies to build new factories won't work for 2 simple reasons. As I said, the first is they've been operating for 100 years, and they've required subsidies continuously throughout that period. If they can't make a successful, profitable business after 100 years and billions in subsidies, why should it work this time? But second, the financial atmosphere has changed dramatically. We now live in an ultra-greedy capitalist society where the fat cats at the very top strip out every single penny they can in share buybacks, dividends, executive salaries, executive bonuses. Jim Farley, Ford's CEO, just got a 26% pay rise. Carlos Torres, Stellantis CEO, just got 56% pay rise. Their workers, after years and years and years of almost zero pay rises, they finally went on strike, and they eventually got a 4-year deal averaging 6% a year. See, once subsidies were meant to expand production or benefit the workers or upgrade factories, now they're seen as being available to line the pockets of the ultra-rich. GM recently proved this. They used profits, borrowing, and probably indirectly some of the subsidies they've received to buy back $10 billion in their own shares in November 2023 and an additional $6 billion in their own shares in June this year. That move directly benefits the major shareholders financially, not in any direct way the factories or the workers, and they had to obviously go on strike to finally get a half-decent living wage. Well, I've little hope that much or any of these subsidies will result in the US legacy auto making better and more affordable family cars, or helping the factories return to a healthy profit and being able to pay back some of those massive debts, or succeeding in the EV world by making budget family cars in massive quantities at a profit. Subsidies, once again, are likely to end up in the pockets of the ultra-rich. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please click the like button. It really does help the YouTube algorithm. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe and click the notification bell so we can notify you each time we release a video. And a massive thank you to our Patreon members. Thank you for your support. Without your support, most of this would not be possible. I'm Dave.